tell us about maybe how he started his career and how it progressed?
Oh, sure, sure. So my dad, Brumsic Brandon Jr., was a cartoonist all his life. I mean, he drew since he was a kid, and he always knew that's what he wanted to do, and that's what he did, So, um, he started doing gag. He moved to New York. He was from DC. My dad was born in DC and ended up going to NYU. And while he was there, he was drawing gag jo cartoons and selling it to magazines here and there, Saturday Evening Review and, different places. Um, but then he also got involved with Freedom Ways, which is, a really important Black journal, of culture and literature, and, his connection with them, he created, political cartoons, yearly. It's a quarterly publication. It was a quarterly publication, but yearly he would have his things in there, and he got a lot of notice with his political cartoons. Really, insightful, and blistering. Speaking about racism in America, and in the 1969, he had an opportunity to do a syndicated comic strip, and he was very pleased to do that. He'd also worked as an animator and did other things, but when he had the opportunity to be syndicated, he came up with Luther, which was started. He started in '68 or '69, but it picked up by the Los Angeles Times Syndicate ultimately in 1970 and ran until 1986. So it's Black characters living in the as they call it, the inner city. That's what they call it back in the day, um, and what life was like living being a young Black child growing up in the inner city.
Great, thank
Yeah.
you. And so he published 6 collections of
Yes.
Luther, right? And so to give us all, an idea of, like, what is that? Because 6 is a small number, but what does the
Yeah.
breadth of that work mean? Like, how many strips did that include?
It's interesting. Yeah, he did 6. That's quite a bit. I mean, my dad did a daily strip. My strip was a weekly. So my dad was a daily. So he has tons and tons and tons of, Luthers. And a lot of them are housed at the Billy Ireland Library and Museum at the Ohio State University. Um, and also in the Library of Congress. They have 6 boxes of his work. Um, so I can't give you a count, but of how many strips were in each book, but it's quite a bit, quite a reasonable amount. And Luther's Got Class is one of his books, and Shirley Chisholm wrote the little foreword for it, which was great. So he got a lot of notice, and even after Luther, he couldn't help himself. He was still doing. He moved to Florida. He was doing political cartoons for Florida Today, and also every other week he would write a column, and the other week he'd do a political cartoon. Um, Unfortunately, Parkinson got him, so he was unable to keep drawing, but he kept creating. He couldn't help himself. That's just who he was. He just kept coming out of him.
I think I would love someday to see all of the Luthers collected, and I wonder like how much digging we'd have to do to find everything, because the originals are scattered, and the books are a relatively small amount of his work, of his body of Luther pieces. They're smaller books,
Yeah.
and he did so much work. And so it's Freedom Ways, it's Luther's, it's the work that he did for Black Resources,
Black resources, yes.
the syndicate, and we're still learning the breadth of that work. There are hundreds and hundreds of strips. And I once did the calculations on the Luthers, and I wish I had that number to pull up. I could probably just do some math on my phone. But it's thousands of strips.
Yeah,
And he never stopped working. Cartooning was his life. And
absolutely.
um, it's humbling to be near all of his work and Barbara's work,
Oh,
and just seeing how much they've contributed to documenting, just documentation and creating historical context. So yeah, it's really, I think talking about them as journalists, as well as cartoonists and chroniclers is an important thing that you brought up, Christine.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, because that is the avenue with which these pieces of work show up. It's in the newspapers, it's in the magazines, it's alongside the text and words of people who are, as you say, reporting on what's happening in our country at a certain time. Um, it's interesting too, like, you know, I'm such a nerd. I'm like, okay, so from strips, dang, how many panels? Because I mean, and did he, in addition to, you know, you mentioned these other publications, Barbara, it wasn't just like, okay, first it started single panel and then it was strips and then it was again, like he did these together,
Yeah,
right? Like it's not like he was multitasking and publishing.
absolutely.
Right.
All the while he had Luther going, he was doing work for Freedom Ways and Black Resources, you know. So he did things just for himself, you know, just for you know, our walls, you know. He and sculptures and paintings and um, brilliant man. Yeah.
And I think so going from there then, illustration and art was in the household, I
Hmm.
would imagine, growing up.
Absolutely.
So how did your father learn that you had an interest in art, and maybe even specifically cartooning?
Um, you know, my dad did. You know, we were in a small house in Newcastle, Long Island. Um, at first, the dining room was his place where he drew and created, which was the center of the house. So it was a lot of traffic, you know, young kids running around. They're like, keep quiet. I was like, what? You know, what is he doing over there? But that's all I knew because he was also, during all this time, Mr. Beebe on a television show.
Right.
And he was creating artwork for that. And he was a performer on that. Um, so, yeah. And then he ultimately built a studio in the basement. And there, nothing but papers and pens and colors and paints and canvases and all that. That's what I grew up with, you know, all over the place. And whenever whenever I wanted to draw or do something, he was very upset one time. I used his magic markers to color in my friend's cast who just had surgery on her legs. I destroyed his markers. He was mortified. I was like, "What?" But it's so beautiful. But he knew that I always had an interest in art. And at some point, he doing a daily is a lot. It's 12 strips every other week. He actually didn't do a Sunday. He did 12 strips every other week. Um, and he also put what's called zipatone on the strip, and that's really tedious. You know, you put the film on top of the drawing and you cut it out. And anyway, he gave me, my sister, and my brother a test to see who had the, you know, a steady hand. I won. We kept up my brother's drawing for a long time because it was so squiggly, just to laugh at him. But I don't think my sister took it. Come to think of it, but it was me and my brother, and I was the one who won. So that's what I did, and you know, I got paid. So to me, that was my allowance growing up. Um, but I did not know I was going to be a cartoonist. I knew I wanted to be in art. I just did not know I wanted to be a cartoonist. And luckily for me, I had parents who supported that. So when I went to school, I was able to go to school to study art, which not every little brown black child can do, you know. Um, so there I was, black kid at Syracuse University studying art, and um, I'm grateful for that experience as well.
I mean, that was also similar to your father, right? Like he had the support of his parents to pursue art,
Yeah,
pursue cartooning, which I think is amazing. And that
yeah.
gave him freedom and that courage and that will. So when he was at NYU, I was just reading about, he had written about himself and Luther, and he talked about bringing cartoons. He sold his very first cartoon when he walked into a magazine. And so he said, you know, he was lucky if he did indeed sell one a week at least, but he would go around every week and try to sell cartoons in person, which was the old way. And
That's the way it was done. Yeah.
And so another anecdote I just read was that his professor at NYU became nervous about critiquing his work in front of the class, which is what Mr. Brandon asked for. And the teacher was like, well, what if I critique something and it's something you've actually, and you say to the class, like, I actually sold this one to a magazine. So I thought that.
That's cool. That's cool.
That is very fun. And so Barbara, how old were you when you did that Zipatone?
I'm going to say I was at junior high. So what does that make me? 12, 13,
Okay.
somewhere around there.
And so then you went to school for art. I'm curious, what was there a specific genre of art that you were studying?
I wish I had studied something specific. I was all over the place. I am going to be a fashion designer. I am going to be an illustrator. I'm going to be a fine artist. I was all over the place. I couldn't narrow it down. I didn't figure out that I could be a cartoonist until I was in my late 20s and at a job interview, and the woman said, her name's Marie Brown. She had a magazine called Elan, which was going to rival Essence back in the day. Beautiful magazine. And I went to her for a job. She's like, well, you're kind of funny and you draw. Do you think you could come up with a comic strip? And I was like, of course. I mean, in my mind, in my small brain, I was saying, I've seen him do it all my life. Of course I could do that.
Yeah.
That's the way I approached it. And that's where it came from. And that's where I'm coming from was born right there when she said, can you do this? And I with the arrogance of I was just like, of course, yeah, I could do that. And I did. you know,
And you
and I
did
did.
So in 1989, it was a
Detroit Free Press. Yeah.
And it ran for was it about a year before it got picked up?
Again, my dad got from the Detroit Free Press, got an invitation, got a letter. He had just won an award for being one of the pioneer Black cartoonists. And Detroit Free Press reached out to him saying, we want our, newspaper to reflect our community. Do you know of any other Black cartoonists? And he said to me, are you going to talk about doing this? Or are you going to actually do this? And I was like, give me a dare. I was like, I'm going to do this. So I sent it to them, and Marty Claus was the managing editor, and she loved it. She's like, I want to go with it. And I signed a deal with them for a weekly. And she encouraged me to reach out to the syndicates. I actually knew that there was no way I could get a lot of papers. I knew newspaper comics. I knew the industry to a degree. I saw my dad. So I knew that you needed a syndicate to get further along. And I knew how they sold their comics to newspapers. So I tried to sell myself to the syndicates. So I created this press kit on myself and sent it to all the syndicates, and got rejected by all but one. Great rejection letters. One was really nice. It was like 2.5 pages. I was like, all right already. I mean, it was about how my stuff wasn't going to work. But one syndicate, Universal Press Syndicate, Lee Salem, bless his heart. He left us, but I loved him so. He was such a champion for me. He loved it, and he's like, let's meet. We met. He gave me a development contract, which where I had to every week I had to send them strips, but every week I was doing strips for Detroit. So I'd pencil them in, send that to Universal Press, ink them in, send that to Detroit Free Press. So it wasn't even like I was really doing any extra work, and I was getting paid a little bit of money. I was like, hey, this works out. And it took about 1.5 years before they said, yes, we're going to go ahead and we're going to try to sell you. And it started out with 2 papers in like Indiana, and I can't even remember the other place. I'd have to look it up, but 2 small papers. And I quit my job. I was like, I'm off to be a cartoonist now. I don't need this other stuff. And but it did okay. It did okay.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, internationally, it also got picked
Yeah.
up, or it was syndicated in newspapers.
I was in the South African Drum. I was in the Gleaner in Jamaica. I was in